to do with infrastructure. In the studio with me is William Mwanza, who is from the Trade Law Centre, TRALAC. William, thanks very much for popping in. I'm sorry about the traffic. It's all to do with the Jazz Festival, you see. I've got this great big wad of projects here, and some impressive ones, some small ones, some big ones, everything from energy to meteorology, but it's all about infrastructure. If you had to take one sector that you could say, right, I'm getting rid of everything, but we have to concentrate on one sector, what would it be? Transport, energy, what?
I would say transport. I think that's the main one. Looking at the transport infrastructure in Africa, I think that's the most binding constraint to production networks and also trade networks across the region. So looking at not only just looking at things like ports, but then going into rail, road, even air, because if you're looking at tourism, it all comes down into all these factors coming in together. So I would really say transport infrastructure, putting in the hard infrastructure, but also the soft infrastructure that goes with it, especially when you're looking at customs and border procedures and all those elements that actually support the hard infrastructure that's in place and actually allow that the service that comes from the infrastructure itself actually flows and feeds into trade.
Just before Gugu asks this question, I mean, when you take a simple example of transport infrastructure, you take the Gau train, and people think, well, it's nice, you can go to the airport now for 110 Rand. But all the things that spring up around Gau train, that boosts the economy, which are unintended consequences. Gugu.
Just on that development of the Gau train, clearly it does help quite a few within Gauteng, but let's talk about sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, William, and if you can give us insights on that. Clearly the key issue here is that infrastructure projects have a long lead time, and are we seeing the cooperation coming through from the other SADC nations in order to boost, let's start off with the transport element of infrastructure firstly amongst this region?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of focus now on regional planning for infrastructure projects. So whereas before countries would actually be looking at national projects, now there's more emphasis on, for example, in the Southern African region, on the SADC region infrastructure master plan, where there's about 100+ projects that have been put together, and countries are actually trying to look at joint financing of implementing these projects. So I would say there's definitely a lot of traction towards more regional planning, and now the next question is really how to finance them. You've talked exactly bang on the point on the long lead times. Not only that, but I think also like preparation of projects and actually getting financing for them is the most critical question, and that's where I think the next issue would really have to be.
Well, I would have thought people would be queuing up. I mean, Africa's such a great story. I mean, we do a story on Africa and with a foreign visitor practically every day on CNBC Africa, and then so enthusiastic about it. They come to Cape Town and they like it. They go to Joburg and it's vibrant, etc. So I would have thought that the international financiers, the international trade financing banks would be knocking on our door. Is that not the case?
It's actually been happening recently now. I think there's a lot of focus now on Africa as the next growth pole in the global economy, and so there's a lot of interest in terms of investment that comes into Africa, but I think the constraint really is there. The infrastructure is not in place for investment to actually thrive, and so multilateral institutions are actually coming together now. There's been a renewed focus on how to tackle the global economic challenges that are being encountered, and now the focus is actually on infrastructure, and on infrastructure not only globally but in developing countries such as Africa. So there's the Global Infrastructure Initiative, which was just implemented in October by the World Bank.
Yes.
And it's actually not only the World Bank but the IMF and all the global multilateral development institutions coming together and saying, okay, I think the next way that we can actually implement to face the global economic challenges is to invest in infrastructure. So the interest very much is there, and then now it's really just for African governments to actually just take advantage of this focus that's now there.
I saw an article on one of the business websites this morning. Actually, it said the way to double the world's 8 trillion GDP economy is to get rid of borders. And there was a picture of a passport. So tear up your passports, allow free movement of labour, free movement of people, etc. When you come to Africa, that's very difficult. You'll drive for 6 hours, and then there'll be a border point. The thing I'm leading to here is if that were to happen, then the infrastructure projects we're talking about, this great big watch here, would have to become pan-African. In other words, going from one country to the next. It's all very well having a road here and then a border. There would have to be a grander scheme, I would have thought, eventually.
Definitely there has to be, if we're looking at continental integration, which is now, I think, taking center stage this year, there's definitely going to be need for focus, I think, on a grander scale. But it would still have to be taken, I think, region by region. And I've given the example of the Southern African Development Community, but this regional planning is also happening, for example, in COMESA, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. It's happening in the Eastern African Community, in the EAC. And all these regional plans, I think, would have to be synchronized and brought into one. But it does come down to neighboring countries actually communicating with each other and actually identifying the projects which they feel would meet at the border, so to speak.
Yes.
And it's all about channeling all the financing towards these projects that actually meet at the border.
William, we can't ignore the Chinese influence when it comes to the infrastructure play on the continent. Can Africans do it alone?
Yeah. I wouldn't say that Africans can do it alone. China definitely has been a big player in terms of financing of infrastructure projects on the continent. But there's also, I think, the development within the BRICS, which is really important. And that's actually the setting up of the new development bank, which the regional headquarters of which is actually going to be in Africa and in South Africa. I think this is one avenue that African governments also have in terms of benefiting not only from Western partners, but also from the new emerging economies such as China.